What I thought I'd do is just give you an overview of my book, or some of the arguments of my book. Again, relatively new book, came out last year, called The Pragmatic Enlightenment, Recovering the Liberalism of Hume, Smith, Montesquieu, and Voltaire. And then hopefully we can just have a discussion about some of the questions I raise and the claims I make. And I'll pass this around if any of you want to take a look while I'm talking here. Again, makes a good Christmas gift, you know. I mean, now, as Richie mentioned, I'm a political theorist in what I think is a pretty typical American mold, meaning that in my work I generally try to combine the two approaches that John Robertson mentioned in his closing remarks. That is, I try to combine on the one hand the historical and the historical and the interpretive, that is the typical concerns of the intellectual historian, with the normative or the theoretical, that is the typical concerns of the philosopher. So in the book I offer both some thoughts about what the Enlightenment was like, right, how we should think about this period, how we should think about this movement. I also make a normative case on behalf of a certain strand of the Enlightenment that I call the Pragmatic Enlightenment, and the kind of moderate, flexible form of liberalism that I argue is embodied in it. And this is my first, thus far all of the talks I've given on the book have been to audiences composed primarily of political theorists and historians. So I've tended to emphasize the normative side of the book thus far, since this is a conference on conceptions of the Enlightenment. I'll obviously try to stress the other side today, the historical interpretive side. But I just wanted to kind of warn you that the normative side is just too central to the book to leave out altogether. So I hope you'll bear with me on that score. So the book is structured around three broad critiques of the Enlightenment, which can be summarized with the terms universalism, rationalism, and individualism. And I'll go into a bit more detail about each of the three critiques in a moment. But before I do, I just want to note how prevalent, how ubiquitous they are. Given how much the Enlightenment did to inspire so many features of our life in the modern liberal West, it's really striking to me how vigorous and enduring and widespread the hostility toward it has been. And a lot of this, of course, goes all the way back to the 18th century with Rousseau and Burke and Herder and others. But I think it's really ballooned in recent decades. So Richie opened the conference by mentioning the work of John Gay, and I think he's in some ways the extreme case. But I do think that the Enlightenment, or the hostility toward the Enlightenment, does a really quite remarkable job of uniting academics from all over the political spectrum in a way that few ideas or few attitudes can. So socialists and conservatives, pluralists and communitarians, postmodernists and religious fundamentalists all seem to want to line up to take a whack at the Enlightenment for one reason or another. The historian Darren McMahon remarks that, quote, Enlightenment bashing has developed into something of an intellectual blood sport, uniting elements of both the left and the right in a common cause. And so this isn't universally true, of course. The last few years have seen the appearance of a number of books defending the Enlightenment. Some are better than others. Many of them are too Kantian for my tastes. But I think it's still fair to say that the critics still outnumber the defenders, at least within the academy. So part of my goal in the book is try to rescue the Enlightenment from being treated as a sort of whipping boy in so many circles. And so here I'm perhaps a bit like Peter Gay, trying to rescue the Enlightenment from the charges of radicalism and utopianism and the rest that we good pragmatic Americans, as Lawrence noted, are ever wary of. So, okay, I want to start by going through the three critiques that I address in the book and say just a bit about why I think they each miss the mark with respect to the four main thinkers whom I discuss, namely David Hume, Adam Smith, Montesquieu, and Voltaire, all of whom, it should go almost without saying, are absolutely central to the Enlightenment on virtually any understanding of its meaning. And I'll come back to this and talk about the different strands of the Enlightenment and the character of the Enlightenment after I go through the three critiques. But I'll just say at the outset, it does seem to me that any criticism of the Enlightenment that doesn't apply to any of these four thinkers stands in need of immense revision, if not of being discarded altogether. The first critique that I address in the book is the claim that the Enlightenment embraced a kind of hegemonic universalism, that the Enlightenment thinkers of the Enlightenment believed in the existence of objective, universal, ahistorical, transcultural truths in morality and politics. So on this view, the Enlightenment was an age of inalienable rights and self-evident truths, an age that thought that there was one right way to live, one right way to organize society, and that any sufficiently rational person can see that this is the case. And this kind of universalism, the critics say, renders the Enlightenment outlook utterly implausible and dangerously exclusive. implausible because it requires ignoring or dismissing historical and cultural diversity, and dangerous because it requires excluding, coercing, or condemning those who don't live up to its own basically liberal ideals. I argue, though, that in fact, Hume, Smith, Montesquieu, and Voltaire all insisted that moral and political standards can do and should vary according to context. So let me take the issue of moral universalism first and then turn to political universalism. So Hume and Smith are, of course, two of the foremost proponents of a sentimentalist moral theory, meaning a theory that derives morality from human emotions, human sentiments, rather than from, say, divine commandments or transcendent natural law or a priori reason or utilitarian calculations and so on. Neither Montesquieu nor Voltaire, admittedly, has a moral theory nearly as kind of fleshed out or sophisticated, frankly, as Hume's or Smith's, but I tried to show that they adopt a basically similar position. So all four of these thinkers, I argue, particularly Hume and Smith, argue that morality arises from the sentiments and then is developed through sympathy, through social interaction, through the everyday dealings and relationships that people have with one another. Which is to say, the way in which moral standards are formulated is the same everywhere and always for these thinkers, but the content of these standards, what actually counts as moral, is in large part socially determined, and so evolves along with evolving communal standards. So this is by no means pure moral relativism. According to this kind of theory, individuals are subject to moral norms that are real and binding and that they don't choose in any direct or immediate sense. Right? In order to be moral, to act morally, we have to abide by the dictates of what Hume calls the general point of view or Smith calls the impartial spectator. But because these standards are in large part socially created, they do depend to a large degree on context. Now, this kind of middle position these thinkers adopt on this question, it seems to me to be a fairly reasonable middle ground between the Scylla of universalism and the Charybdis of relativism. But my point is less to argue that these thinkers are right. Their moral theories are right. They tell us accurately what morality consists of. Rather, I'm just trying to call attention to the heavy contextual element of their moral theories, which I think flatly contradicts the idea that they embraced a hegemonic form of moral universalism. Turning then to the political realm, here there's a certain element of universalism inherent in the political theories of Hume, Smith, Montesquieu, and Voltaire, insofar as they were all, at the end of the day, liberals. That's to say, they all advocated things like limited government, religious toleration, freedom of expression, commerce, and so on. But it's also important to note that their liberalism was quite pragmatic, quite flexible in both its basis and its implications. So for the basis of their liberalism, I argue that these thinkers all adopted what we would now call a non-foundationalist approach to politics. So they're good empiricists. They argue why are liberal practices and institutions good, not because they're somehow in accord with capital R reason or capital N nature. For instance, Locke had said, this is Locke's basic argument. Rather, they just think historical, comparative, empirical analysis revealed them to be better than the alternatives. Liberal commercial societies are, in their view, just better, just preferable to the other types of society that we observe around the world and throughout history. Nor did they rely on a single standard or a single benchmark in making these comparisons. So sometimes they praise liberal regimes and practices because of the freedom, personal freedom they afford. Other times they praise the security they provide, the happiness they produce, the prosperity they make possible, the character traits they encourage, and so on. So there's something like Berlinian value pluralists, I think, in this respect. As for the implications that these thinkers drew from their liberalism, none of them believed in a single best or uniquely legitimate form of government. On the contrary, they all stressed that different laws and practices are appropriate for different societies with different circumstances and histories and customs and so on. This is the basic point of the spirit of the laws, for instance, right? Montesquieu says that so great are the differences between nations that in almost no case are the laws of one entirely suitable for another. And they all essentially set aside the notion, which had been so central to Locke, among others, that there's a specific set of criteria that all regimes have to meet in order to be legitimate. This is the basic point of Locke's second treatise, and they all kind of brush this question aside. Which again, isn't to say that these thinkers had no political principles or they had no political preferences, but rather that their liberal political principles and preferences were sufficiently flexible that they didn't insist on or frankly even allow for a single set of institutions that would be applicable in all times and places. So in both the moral and political realms, I think these Enlightenment thinkers were far more pragmatic, far less universalist than they're generally taken to be. I know I'm covering a lot of ground quite quickly here. The book is quite wide-ranging, perhaps too wide-ranging, and I'm just trying to give you a quick overview. I'm happy to talk about any of this in more detail after I go through the general outline. So the second basic critique of the Enlightenment that I focus on in the book is that the claim that the Enlightenment had a blind faith in reason, right? It's of course known widely, or has long been known as the age of reason. In chapter 3 of the book, I spend a good deal of time demonstrating that my four thinkers in fact stress the limits of human reason, that they were all cautious empiricists rather than dogmatic rationalists. They were incredibly skeptical of rational systems and system builders. They by no means thought that science or the scientific method could give us conclusive or complete knowledge of the natural world. And even that they took a generally moderate stance with respect to religion, that their skepticism with regard to religion was simply a manifestation of their general skepticism regarding any claims of absolute certainty. But in the interest of time, I'll leave that part of the argument aside for now and concentrate on the political side of the rationalist critique. And here a paradigmatic example is Michael Oakeshott's claim that the thinkers of the Enlightenment wanted to bring all laws and institutions and practices before the supposedly infallible tribunal of reason and to discard those wanting by its standard, right? Just wipe the political, social slate clean and start society anew from scratch, which of course in Oakeshott's view leads to dangerous attempts at social engineering and to upheavals like the French Revolution. But even Oakeshott concedes that Hume, Smith, and Montesquieu are exceptions to this supposed rule, right? Hume is a skeptic who distrusts grand schemes to reform society. Smith derides men of system, as he calls them, who view society like a chessboard whose pieces they can move around however they want. And one of the chief reasons why Montesquieu stresses just how many factors go into forming the spirit of the laws is precisely to discourage attempts at general reform, especially based on abstract, quote-unquote, rational principles. So the need for moderation, the need to accept imperfections in politics is a constant theme in all of their writings. And in my view, these are pretty big exceptions, right? Exceptions, they don't prove the rule, they prove that the rule needs to be modified. So Voltaire, for his part, is often seen as an arch-rationalist, a perfect example of someone who wants to burn all existing laws and start afresh. He has one line to that effect. But I argue that he too was far more moderate and pragmatic than this traditional view would suggest, at least with respect to politics. In fact, in an article in the journal The Review of Politics from a few years ago, I made a similar case for Denis Diderot. Diderot doesn't figure that much in the book, all that much, but I think something similar could be said for one of Jonathan Israel's archetypal radical Enlightenment thinkers. So that when you actually sit down and read Voltaire's and Diderot's works, rather than just pulling a choice quotation or two out of context, I think it's pretty unambiguous that they preferred gradual or incremental change and generally opposed the notion of political revolution, whatever use the French revolutionaries later made of them. So to suggest that they actually wanted to wipe the slate clean and start from scratch, I think is to drastically overestimate their expectations from politics, or philosophy for that matter. None of which is to say that these thinkers, even Hume or Smith, were Burkean conservatives, that they admired tradition as such, they saw it as having a presumptive claim to wisdom or anything of the sort. They're, I think, on the contrary, utterly devoid of any nostalgic longings for a lost world. Hume and Smith see the past as horrible, frankly. It's only very recently that liberty and security had been established, even in Britain. And they did want to move their society forward in what they saw as a more liberal, humane direction. They were progressives, reformers, not just advocates of the status quo. But I think it's equally true that they believed resolutely in piecemeal reform and opposed the idea of imposing an abstract, comprehensive, rational ideal on society. So once again, I think these thinkers are far more skeptical, pragmatic, flexible than they and the Enlightenment as a whole are often taken to be. The third and final critique of the Enlightenment that I tackle in the book is the claim that the Enlightenment fostered a kind of atomism or individualism, that by focusing on individuals and rights rather than communal ties and duties, by ignoring the shared values and attachments that invariably give meaning to people's lives, they reduce people to self-interested, rights-bearing atoms, and thereby made a healthy community impossible. This critique is, of course, often tied to the Enlightenment's embrace of what we now call negative liberty rather than positive liberty, or to its embrace of commerce, or both. And here I think there's a grain of truth to this critique with respect to Hume, Smith, Montesquieu, and Voltaire, much more so than with the rationalism critique, the second one I discussed. Because I think it's fair to say that these four thinkers all did adopt a generally negative conception of liberty. It's certainly fair to say that they all applauded commerce and the arrival of commercial society. But here I think it's important to look at some of their background assumptions, if you will, and why they advocated what they did. So first of all, we should note that none of these four thinkers adopted the reductive view of human nature that the critics bemoaned. So none of them saw people as unencumbered selves, to use Michael Sandel's term, if any of you are familiar with Sandel. On the contrary, they all saw human beings as inherently social, drawn to others not just for instrumental reasons, but also out of an innate desire for companionship. And they all agreed that people's characters and beliefs and values are fundamentally shaped by their circumstances, their communities, their interactions with others, not somehow developed in a vacuum. Again, think of how their moral theories work through sympathy, through social interaction. It's only in and through society that we become moral beings at all for them. As for their political ideals, these thinkers, I argue, advocated negative liberty precisely because they thought that communities that are dedicated to shared ends and supposedly higher practices are often far from communal, far from harmonious, that on the contrary, they tend to produce or entail coercion and exclusion and intolerance. So I think they would have seen the pitting of the individual against the community that we in kind of 80s and 90s was so popular among political theorists, the communitarian liberal debate. They would have seen this pitting of the one against the other as a false dichotomy, that by focusing on the individual and the protection of his or her negative liberties, they were trying to avoid the kinds of conflicts produced by the pursuit of consensus. They're trying to safeguard the community precisely by focusing on the individual in this way. So to put it another way, they emphatically weren't trying to undercut the concern for virtue or the concern for others, but rather to challenge the persistent efforts on the part of the political and ecclesiastical authorities to inculcate virtue through a coercive means, which they thought that history had shown to be counterproductive. Similarly, they didn't support commerce and economic freedoms in order to encourage unbridled greed and unbridled greed and selfishness, but rather in hopes of finding a healthier way of uniting people than the traditional bonds of blood and religion and nationalism and so on. They thought, as Albert Hirschman and others have emphasized in recent years, that a focus on material self-interest would help to replace passions like xenophobia and religious intolerance, and the thirst for military glory, which are not just dangerous, but divisive, right? Divide the community. So they saw commerce as drawing people together, making them more interconnected, not as atomizing them. So in other words, they supported negative liberty in commerce, at least in part on what we might call communitarian grounds. They thought that these things would help to foster a healthier, more cohesive community. So to sum up the argument thus far as briefly as I can, I try to show that for each vice that's regularly attributed to the Enlightenment, these four thinkers actually exhibited the contrary virtue. So rather than adopting a hegemonic form of moral and political universalism, they emphasized the importance of context in the formulation of moral standards and adopted a flexible, non-foundationalist form of liberalism. Rather than exhibiting a blind faith in reason, they continually stressed the limits and fallibility of human understanding and advocated a cautious reformism in politics. And rather than promoting atomistic individualism, they saw people as inherently social and sought a healthier, more reliable way to unite them than the traditional bonds which they found above all in commerce. So in other words, I think the outlooks of these four thinkers fly in the face of all of the main criticisms of the Enlightenment. Now, as is probably blindingly obvious by now, I find the broad outlooks of these thinkers, this kind of moderate, flexible, pragmatic form of liberalism that I'm attributing to them, to be quite compelling, quite attractive. But rather than spend any more time on this kind of normative side of the book, let me turn to some more historical interpretive points about the nature of the Enlightenment that I think emerged from my study and some thoughts about how my understanding of the Enlightenment, my conception of the Enlightenment, compares to some of the other prominent views of the period. So first, and perhaps most obviously, my reading of the Enlightenment, I think, challenges the idea that the French and Scottish Enlightenments were deeply dissimilar or even diametrically opposed. So this view isn't quite as popular today as it once was, but has a long lineage. It's been around at least since the time of Edmund Burke. I think Gertrude Himmelfarb is probably the most prominent contemporary proponent of this, but the idea that the French philosophers were rationalist and abstract and radical, whereas the Scots were sentimentalist and empirical and conservative. And I'm, of course, trying to show that two key thinkers on each side of this supposed divide, arguably the two key thinkers on each side of the divide, adopted quite similar outlooks in many crucial respects. So that contrary to what you might expect from the caricatures of each of the national enlightenments, Montesquieu and Voltaire were neither rationalists, nor political radicals, nor revolutionaries, nor were Hume and Smith always conservative, right? I think few tracts were more provocative in an 18th century context than Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion. Smith himself calls The Wealth of Nations a very violent attack on the whole commercial system of Great Britain. So they're not as conservative, in my view, as they're sometimes made out to be. It's true that the charges of rationalism and radicalism and the rest might be fairly applied to some of the other, dare I say, lesser philosophers, such as D'Holbach, Helvetius, La Mettrie. I read these thinkers as more or less outliers. I think Helvetius and La Mettrie in particular come in for frequent, often fierce criticism from the other philosophers themselves. I think most of the leading thinkers of the French Enlightenment, Montesquieu and Voltaire, of course, but also figures like D'Alembert, Condillac, Condorcet, Diderot, in fact, shared much of the pragmatism and moderation that prevailed on the other side of the channel. So just as our own John Robertson makes a compelling case for the Enlightenment against those who would pluralize it out of existence by showing that two of the extreme geographic poles of the Enlightenment, Scotland and Naples, shared a good deal of intellectual common ground. So too, I'd argue that the two national Enlightenments that are often seen as the extreme ideological poles of the period, the French and Scottish Enlightenments, had far more in common than is ordinarily supposed. My reading of the Enlightenment also, just as obviously, I think, challenges Jonathan Israel's conception of this movement. So Israel, as we've already discussed, bifurcates the Enlightenment into an atheistic, materialist, egalitarian, and revolutionary radical Enlightenment on the one hand, and an intellectually modest and socially conservative, moderate mainstream Enlightenment on the other. He says that this split within the Enlightenment was, quote, much the most fundamental and important thing about it. And this argument that these two sides of the Enlightenment were fundamentally distinct, irreconcilably opposed, and that it was the ideas of the radical Enlightenment alone that eventually transformed the entire Western world, has, as Adam Sutcliffe has noted, been contested by many, above all for imposing an unrealistically stark dichotomy on a complex reality, again, too schematic, and for overemphasizing the influence of Spinoza and his radical followers. Nor certainly do all scholars share Israel's palpable sympathy for radicalism. I think several recent studies by political theorists have reminded us that there's, in fact, much to be said on behalf of moderation. And I hope that my book adds to that reminder. Hume, Smith, Montesquieu, and Voltaire all fall into the moderate camp of Israel's schema, sometimes comfortably, sometimes not. But either way, I'm of course trying to show that there's much of value in their thought. But I'm also trying to offer a slightly different challenge to Israel's thesis. So rather than simply reversing his value claim and saying, boo radical enlightenment, yay moderate enlightenment, I'd also suggest that in some ways a more fundamental split than the one between the radicals and the moderates, at least where political theory is concerned, is a split between the thinkers of what I'm calling the pragmatic enlightenment on the one hand and some of the more idealistic thinkers of the period on the other. So certainly many important forms or strands of Enlightenment thought were not pragmatic in the sense that I'm using this term. So you think of Lockean contractarianism, Kantian deontology, Benthamite utilitarianism, some of the more radical followers of Spinoza that Israel highlights. A lot of these views were highly idealistic in character, grounded in first principles like the immutable dictates of natural law, or the rational and therefore categorical requirements of human dignity, or the universal imperative to maximize the greatest good of the greatest number. Again, though, the outlooks of Hume, Smith, Montesquieu, and Voltaire were far more pragmatic in many different senses of the term. I perhaps should have started with this. When I use the word pragmatic, I'm not referring to American pragmatism, Paris Dewey at all, but rather the way we use the adjective. So their views are grounded in experience, empirical observation, not transcendent or a priori first principles. They're trying to address what they see as practical human concerns, not satisfy abstract standards of right derived from God or nature or reason. They want to apply their principles flexibly with due attention to the importance of context and circumstance. They favor gradual piecemeal reform over the pursuit of perfection or the imposition of strict requirements for legitimacy, and so on. So I mean pragmatic in all of these types of senses. And I should note that the Pragmatic Enlightenment, thus understood, would include not just Hume, Smith, Montesquieu, and Voltaire, but I think also a host of others. So in the book, I give a list of potential members of the Pragmatic Enlightenment that includes, once again, D'Alembert, Condillac, Condorcet, and Diderot in France, Adam Ferguson, John Miller, and William Robertson in Scotland, Edward Gibbon, Josiah Tucker, maybe even Samuel Johnson in England, Gotthold Lessing, Moses Mendelssohn, Christoph Wieland in Germany, Beccaria, Ferdinando Galiani, Antonio Genovese, Pietro Verri in Italy. Now that was a really dangerous list to offer, insofar as I don't count myself an expert on any of these thinkers. So maybe take that list with more than a few grains of salt. All I'm saying is, from what I do know about these thinkers, I think they're at least candidates for inclusion in the Pragmatic Enlightenment. I'm just trying to stress that this strand of the Enlightenment that I'm highlighting and defending isn't limited to these four. I think it was a very broad and certainly underappreciated strand of the Enlightenment, even if it doesn't make up the whole of the Enlightenment. Now, these categories, what I've called the pragmatic and idealistic enlightenments, are only meant to be suggestive. So I don't want to set up a new pair of, irreconcilably, I'm having trouble with that word today, I apologize, opposed blocks of Enlightenment thought to replace Israel's pair. Instead of radical and moderate, we have pragmatic and idealist, and they're at war with one another. I think it is too much to suppose we can neatly categorize everyone in that way. The categories are bound to have blurry edges and the rest, and there are many, many differences within these broad groupings, right? The difference between Locke and Kant and Bentham, all of whom I'm categorizing as idealists in some sense, are enormous on many fronts. Philosophers would hit me in the head with a book for grouping them together that way. But I think these categories are cut across Israel's dichotomy in an interesting way, insofar as the Pragmatic Enlightenment, as I've been outlining it, would comprise not just moderates, as he regards my four to be, Hume, Smith, Montesquieu, and Voltaire, but also, at least on my reading, some of the key thinkers who he sees as radicals, like Diderot and Condorcet. Well, the idealistic strands of Enlightenment thought would include not only many of the more radical philosophers who Israel admires so much, but also key moderates like Locke and Kant. So again, I'm not just trying to reverse Israel's value claim and say, make a case on behalf of the moderate Enlightenment, in part because I'm not entirely sympathetic to a lot of the more influential moderates, right? The idealistic moderates like Locke and Kant, who in some respects have more followers today than the more pragmatic thinkers I'm emphasizing. But also, I think, again, as far as political theory is concerned, where a thinker falls on this pragmatism, idealism spectrum is in some respects more important, more fundamental than the place in Israel's radical moderate dichotomy. And here again, I agree that the materialism that looms so central for Israel isn't as central in my reading. Now, all of this talk about the different strands of the Enlightenment, right? French, Scottish, radical moderate, pragmatic idealist, raises the question of the coherence of the Enlightenment, the extent to which we can say there was the Enlightenment at all in the singular with a definite article and a capital E. And this has been brought up several times already. As we all know, this term used to describe a specific period and movement of thought didn't arise until the late 19th century. And there's a trend among 18th century scholars to regard this term as useless or harmful insofar as it serves to paper over the diversity of this period. I think John Pocock has been, in some respects, the leader of this trend to pluralize the Enlightenment. James Schmidt, who Marion mentioned this morning, is another leader in this regard. I frankly agree with Professor Robertson that this debate it seems to me a bit stale, but I'm going to say just a word or two about this since it seems to be inevitable by this point. I certainly understand this impulse to pluralize the Enlightenment. I even sympathize with it to a certain extent, but I also do want to push back against it a bit. So there's no question, and I don't think almost anyone would argue that would disagree that the Enlightenment was a multifaceted, diverse movement. Again, throughout the book, I'm focusing on just one strand of Enlightenment thought, what I'm calling the Pragmatic Enlightenment, and differentiating it throughout with the more idealistic strands represented by Locke and Kant and Bentham and others. On the other hand, this bigger claim, the broader claim that the Enlightenment simply didn't exist, that it makes no sense to talk about it in these terms, seems to me to go much too far. I think it's important not to miss the forest for the trees here. the presence of diversity within a movement doesn't keep it from being a movement, right? The fact that there are national or ideological or other subgroups within the Enlightenment doesn't mean the broader category, the Enlightenment, doesn't exist, right? There are differences between isosceles triangles and equilateral triangles, but there's still a broader category, triangle, that encompasses both of them. There are differences between Luther and Calvin, but did this make the whole idea of a Protestant Reformation totally unintelligible? I think, of course not. And the very fact that those who want to pluralize the Enlightenment, like Pocock, continue to speak of the various strands of thought during this period as Enlightenments, right? The English and French Enlightenments, early Enlightenments, Armenian, Socinian Enlightenments, and so on, seems to suggest that there's some common core underlying them all, right? Otherwise, why refer to them all as Enlightenments at all? Nor, in my view, does such a category have to fit or encompass every thinker and every idea in the 18th century. So I think this is part of what motivates the critics of this idea of the Enlightenment in the singular capital letter, is that they argue essentially that there's no principled grounds by which to say, you know, one thinker is in, one thinker is out, one idea is in, one idea is out. So we should just use this as a temporal adjective used to designate the entirety of the period. But this, of course, makes the whole term totally superfluous because the temporal or period designation alone would suffice for that purpose, right? So what point is there in calling Voltaire an Enlightenment thinker if all you mean is that he's an 18th century thinker? Just call him an 18th century thinker. It seems to me more sensible to narrow the scope and ask instead whether there's a certain kind of thinker or a certain set of widely shared principles and values that can plausibly be said to make up the Enlightenment. And one powerful reason to suppose that it is possible to identify the Enlightenment in this manner, in my view, is that many of the leading thinkers of 18th century Europe saw themselves as part of a common party or a collective enterprise, right? The Republic of Letters, the Party of Humanity, they had terms for these things. To me, it's one of the more striking features of the Enlightenment, the deliberate, self-conscious nature of the movement, the awareness on the part of its proponents of a broad set of shared goals and of their distinctive place in history. So then what did the Enlightenment outlook consist of? What is the common core that they all shared? This question will be, of course, debated by scholars until the end of time. But as I say in my book, I think Professor Robertson's definition in his book, The Case for the Enlightenment, is a good starting point. This is a quote, "The commitment to understanding and hence to advancing the causes and conditions of human betterment in this world." Again, I think this is a good starting point. As a political theorist, I naturally gravitate toward the political side of these thinkers' aim to promote human betterment in this world. And to make a long story short, it seems to me that we can construct a coherent understanding of the Enlightenment around their shared support for a set of broadly liberal principles and values. Again, things like limited government, religious toleration, freedom of expression, commerce, and so on. The widespread embrace of these ideals among the leading thinkers of this period is all the more striking when we recall that throughout much of Europe, the 18th century was still an age of royal absolutism, hereditary hierarchy, religious persecution as a formal policy, political and ecclesiastical censorship, slavery, colonialism, routine judicial torture, and that France didn't burn its last witch until 1745. I think when you put yourself in their shoes, in their historical context, the intellectual coherence of the Enlightenment becomes more apparent. They're arguing against much of what they saw around them. In fact, I submit that those 18th century thinkers who diverged from these broad liberal ideals that I just mentioned, to the extent of the divergence, also diverged from the Enlightenment. So I made this case at length regarding the 18th century thinker who most resists all categorization, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I think the case is even clearer for the conservative Catholic so-called anti-philosophes who've been brought to our attention by Darren McMahon, among others. It seems to me somewhat silly, actually, to say that simply because someone lived in the 18th century, they were an Enlightenment thinker. But again, there were important differences, even among those 18th century thinkers who belonged to the Enlightenment, who were liberals. So to borrow a concept of John Rawls, you can't escape among political theorists, we can think of the Enlightenment as a kind of overlapping consensus in which all members of the Enlightenment shared a number of basic liberal ideals, but did so in different ways and for different reasons. So for example, some Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke promoted liberal ideals on natural law or natural rights grounds. Others like Kant grounded them in the requirements of human dignity. Still others like Bentham based them on the imperative to maximize utility. while yet others, including Hume, Smith, Montesquieu, and Voltaire, advocated these ideals on non-foundationalist grounds, or at least so I've argued. Moreover, these different ways of grounding their shared liberal ideals also led to some differences in the character of the liberalism espoused by different Enlightenment thinkers. So for some, liberalism was a radical or even revolutionary outlook. Think of Thomas Paine, for instance. While for others, including again the four thinkers who are the focus of my book, it was a more moderate and reformist one. Similarly, the liberalism of some Enlightenment thinkers was highly individualistic in conception, rooted in individual rights and choices and interests, while that of the pragmatic strand of the Enlightenment was more insistent on the social nature of human beings and more concerned with the character of the community. All of which, of course, leads me back to the three critiques with which I began this talk and around which my book is structured: the Enlightenment's alleged rigid universalism, dogmatic rationalism, and narrow individualism. And again, I'm fully conceding that the outlooks of some of the more idealistic Enlightenment thinkers, Locke, Kant, and so on, do fall prey to these critiques, or some of these critiques to greater and lesser degrees. Again, I'm not trying to defend the Enlightenment as a whole, just this one strand of it, but a pretty central, influential strand that eludes the charges of all of the Enlightenment's critics, in many cases stands in diametrical opposition to them. And this brings me to the last question that I want to tackle today, namely, why the Enlightenment has so widely and persistently been seen as so rigidly universalist, dogmatically rationalist, and narrowly individualist, when such key thinkers of the period as Hume, Smith, Montesquieu, and Voltaire, among many others, controvert each aspect of this caricature. This is, of course, a huge, complex historical question. It would take at least a lecture of its own to do any justice to, but it's so, frankly, obvious a question, given everything I've said thus far, that I want to make at least a few preliminary suggestions on this score. So one source of the caricature of the Enlightenment surely is its relationship or perceived relationship to the French Revolution. So during the revolutionary period and the succeeding years, both the proponents and critics of the revolution had a vested interest in depicting philosophers like Voltaire and to a lesser degree Montesquieu as adherents of the revolutionary ideology. So the proponents of the revolution wanted to claim the authority of the philosophers for their cause, right? Voltaire's on our side. Whereas the critics wanted to show that this crisis was brought on by a relatively small cabal of instigators, rather than by fundamental deep-seated problems in the ancien regime. The reputations of Hume and Smith, on the other hand, were distorted in the opposite direction. They were read as narrow conservatives or even reactionaries by those who wanted to save them from association with the revolution. So in other words, the supporters of Hume and Smith sought to distance them from the Enlightenment, which they associated above all with France and its alleged radicalism and rationalism. And so as a result, the kind of narrative that the revolutionary generation handed down to posterity tended to, on the one hand, exaggerate the differences between the leading philosophers and the more preeminent Scottish thinkers, making what were, in my view, mostly differences in tone and temperament and context seem like crucial differences in substantive ideals. And more broadly, the Enlightenment itself came to be associated with revolutionary notions of universal natural rights and the triumph of reason and so on, rather than with the kind of moderate, flexible liberalism that was, in my view, so characteristic of so many leading thinkers of the period. A more recent, but in some ways equally conspicuous source of the Enlightenment's reputation for universalism, rationalism, and individualism has been the staggeringly disproportionate scholarly focus on Kant as the chief representative of the period, at least among political theorists and philosophers. So Kant is regularly taken to be the prototypical Enlightenment thinker for a bunch of different reasons. First, he of course wrote this famous essay called What is Enlightenment, which is very conveniently, all too conveniently taken as, well, this is what the Enlightenment stood for. Also, just Kant's sheer influence. He's arguably exerted greater influence over contemporary moral and political philosophy than any other canonical thinker. The many followers of John Rawls and Jürgen Habermas and others are far more likely to appeal to Kant as their intellectual forebear than to thinkers like Hume, Smith, Montesquieu, and Voltaire, who don't have as many kind of contemporary followers. Smith has his self-proclaimed followers, of course, but the vast majority of them are admirers of what they take to be his views on economic policy and not to his broader moral political thought. And last, the Enlightenment's critics tend to find this focus on Kant congenial because His thought is in some ways tailor-made for those who want to take aim at the Enlightenment's alleged universalism and rationalism and the rest. But of course, Kant represents only one strand of the Enlightenment and far from the dominant one at that. In fact, many aspects of his thought, I would argue, mark a self-conscious departure from the other leading strands of 18th century thought. And Richie already gave you kind of part of my list this morning, but perhaps most obviously, Kant criticizes most of his Enlightenment predecessors for having based morality on empirical or heteronymous and thus contingent factors like human sentiments, the consequences of one's actions, and the norms of one's society. Other notable Kantian departures from the great majority of his contemporaries and predecessors include his radical separation of the phenomenal world and the noumenal world, his understanding of freedom in terms of obeying a self-prescribed law out of pure respect for the law itself, regardless of the consequences, his hypothetical contractarianism, insistence on the unconditional obedience to the established authorities, his belief in the inevitability of perpetual peace. I think there are many things, many areas where he diverged from his contemporaries. And so again, I think to equate the Enlightenment with Kant is to miss a great deal of what it stood for. Connected with both of these points about the French Revolution and about Kant is what I think may be the most fundamental reason for the prevalence and persistence of the caricatured view of the Enlightenment, which is that the Enlightenment did so much to inspire and encourage the liberal values and practices and institutions of the modern West. And so critics of liberalism from across the political spectrum and from the 18th century to the present have sought to portray the thinkers of this period as rigid universalists, dogmatic rationalists, and narrow individualists in an attempt to color the way liberalism itself is viewed. So from Rousseau to Foucault and from Maistre to MacIntyre, those who have found liberal principles and liberal societies wanting have almost invariably laid much of the blame at the Enlightenment's doorstep. So the critics want to render their attacks on liberalism all the more comprehensive and all the more conclusive by showing that all these alleged shortcomings of liberalism, the undermining of community and religion and the injustices of capitalism and the ills wrought by modern science and all these things, these shortcomings aren't incidental or avoidable aspects of liberalism, but rather inherent in its very origins, right? Inherent in the Enlightenment itself. Liberals from Tocqueville to Rawls have, for whatever reason, and I'm not sure what that reason is, proven, in my view, all too willing to distance themselves from the Enlightenment and thereby, in effect, to abandon its legacy to the critics. But when these liberals accept or even embrace this damning depiction of the Enlightenment advanced by the critics, they not only, I think, make an interpretive mistake, they also abandon the argumentative high ground. I think it's precisely because our conception of the Enlightenment so deeply colors our views of liberalism in the modern West that it's so crucial for us to understand it for ourselves rather than to allow our view of it to be shaped by the legacy of the French Revolution and the scholarly fascination with Kant and the biases of liberalism's critics. And this is, frankly, what really motivated me to write this book in the first place. In my view, the legacy of the Enlightenment is far more than just an academic question. So given all that we've inherited from the Enlightenment, again, our liberal democratic politics, our market capitalist economies, our embrace of technological progress and scientific inquiry, our toleration of religious pluralism, all these central features of the West were encouraged or inspired by Enlightenment thought. I think because of that, his legacy is necessarily of great importance to us. So in the States, we argue endlessly over the character of the American founding. So were the founders Lockean liberal or classical Republican? Were they Christian or secular? Was it a movement conducted on behalf of we the people, or was it just a conspiracy of the propertied elite? And these questions matter so much to so many people, of course, because our understanding of the American founding influences the way we see the contemporary United States. And I think similarly, our understanding of the Enlightenment forms an important part of how we understand the modern liberal West. So if all the strands of the Enlightenment did in fact have the rigidly universalist, dogmatically rationalist, narrowly individualist character that the critics ascribe to it, then it might very well make sense for us to abandon it as they urge. But if, as I'm arguing, at least one central and influential strand of the Enlightenment doesn't fall prey to these charges, then perhaps today's liberals should return to their Enlightenment origins with a more open, more sympathetic mind than they've often done in recent years. Perhaps in fact, the Enlightenment still has something to teach us. I'll stop there. I know I made a number of fairly big claims without offering much in the way of detail or concrete evidence, but I'd be very happy to hear your thoughts or try to answer any questions you may have.